to the whether unity is found in Protestantism. The members of any church can come together in peace. Oh, well, we said that. Okay, we're on 21:19. But the objection is of any church can come together in peace by means of established articles such as creeds, etc., etc., etc. Then the instance, the hierarchy is thought to be the principle of unity, but the High Church in England professes to have a divinely constituted hierarchy. See, the Church of England, not the Church of England, but the Church of England is divided into the High Church, the Broad Church, and the Low Church, depending on how Protestant or Catholic you want to be. Right? So High Church is, in its ceremonies, hardly distinguishable from Catholic ceremonies. The only difference is that they do them better than the Catholics do, because that's all they have. It's all ceremony and incense and fluff and vestments, etc. It's something like FSSP, and it's in the context of Protestantism, but it's all Catholic ceremonial. So you would have a hard time telling a High Church missal from a Catholic missal. We actually had some here, and I thought they were Catholic until I really started looking through them. A couple of things I caught. The Pope turns out to be the chief bishop. All right, and you see that. All right, so that's what they call the Pope. But they pray for him and all that stuff. But it's all a sham. They're Protestant down to their fingertips with that idea of free examination, and you decide what dogmas you believe and don't believe. Right. The same thing is true about these Latin Mass organizations. It's just ceremony, and they do those ceremonies absolutely perfectly. And they have the most beautiful vestments I've ever seen in certain cases. They must have tremendous amounts of money. They get into those big churches, usually downtown, and they have magnificent churches. They attract a lot of people that way. So that's High Church Novus Ordo. Then the Broad Church is exactly what it sounds like. It's sort of somewhat Protestant, somewhat Catholic, and then Low Church is totally Protestant. So it's talking about the High Church here. It became very prevalent. In the 19th century, there was, I think, Newman was part of that High Church thing for a while, and the famous Lord Halifax was a big High Churchman. He was the prime minister in the 1930s, Halifax, yes. And then a few other prominent people. Pusey was well, I don't know if he was an architect, but he did architecture. He was very much involved in the revival of Gothic architecture in the 19th century. There was a big revival. See, 19th century architecture was so horrible that people started to go back either to the classical period, so you had a lot of classical architecture going up, for example, in Washington, D.C. Because 19th century architecture is horrible. And so, or it went to Gothic. So there were a lot of neo-Gothic churches, like St. Patrick's Cathedral, various other cathedrals in this country. Newark has a magnificent, that's about the only thing it has that's magnificent. Newark, New Jersey has a great cathedral. Most of the cathedrals in this country are Gothic, probably. So that was 19th century. So you had, and then the classical architecture, the neoclassical architecture. So, but Pusey was a very influential in that. So there were a lot of neo-Gothic churches built in England during that time. By the way, the Church of England has just named a woman bishop as the Archbishop of Canterbury. So, inclusion. So anyway, I distinguish the major. A hierarchy endowed with due conditions is the principle of unity I concede. Deprived of these conditions, I deny. And I distinguish the minor. The High Church professes a hierarchy which is fictitiously divine, I concede. Truly divine, I deny. And indeed, the Anglican hierarchy has no authority, for no legitimate title of succession can be assigned to them who left the Roman Church under the leadership of Henry VIII and Elizabeth I. So they would have purely material succession. And most theologians would concede to them, just as it concedes to the Greek Orthodox, a purely material succession. And that is, they have named people, just like the lady that just became the Archbishop, the bishopette of Canterbury. And she's the 106th to be named. So they go back actually to Catholicism. And there's just one named after the other, just like, there's a succession of presidents or something. It has nothing to do with a legitimate nomination. See, that's now you get some, you have to understand that the term formal, some authors say, is only with jurisdiction. Other authors say it happens when there is a legitimate designation. So be careful of that word, formal. Some authors use it differently. Some authors say, unless you have the mission, you're not in formal succession. Others say formal is the fact that it has the forma of a real succession. See, that there's a legitimate succession. Then material is, purely material is something that is, again, authors would say, Greek Orthodox and Anglicans have a purely material, that is, they happen to have named one after the other. They didn't break that line. All right, so just so when you read that, be careful, know the language of your author, because you'll see different things thrown around with that, okay? Because I did a lot of research on that. So that's what it's saying, has no legitimate succession. Add to this the fact that the orders of the Anglican clergy are rightly and with merit considered invalid. That was declared by Leo XIII in 1899, much to the chagrin of the Anglicans, because they want to be seen as a branch of the Catholic Church. And we're one branch and they're another. So that dashed the Anglican hierarchy. But we will speak about this later. This Anglican hierarchy is rejected by most Protestants. See, it's Lutherans and everybody else say forget it. The Presbyterians, they say they were established. Presbyter means priests, so they were established because they didn't like the Anglican hierarchy. See, bishops, Episcopalian Church in this country is the Anglican Church. Episcopalian, it has bishops. See. But the Presbyterians rejected the notion of bishops. That's why they're called their clergy are called presbyters or elders or something like that. In other words, they rejected the Anglican bishops, and that was Scotland, typically. John Knox was the founder of Presbyterianism. Right? And then you have the Methodists. The Methodists were a pious reaction to rationalism in the Anglican Church in the 18th century. So that was Wesley. I think the first name was John. So he was sort of getting the people stirred up with more piety, the Methodists. That was the 1750s around there. Excuse me. So that's Anglicanism in its various branches. Then there's the Quakers. That's why they were called the Quakers, because they would have their services, and then the spirit came, and they would start shaking, and that's why they're called. Then there's the Shakers too. There's the Quakers and the Shakers. It's true. That's another sect. They're in Vermont someplace. The Shakers. They even have a style of furniture named for them. Yeah, I'm not kidding you. All right, so that they are also offshoots of Anglicanism. Pennsylvania, he was a Quaker. This was they're still in the Philadelphia area. They run hospitals or something like that. You know, they have virtually no dogmas. So, see, in the same hierarchy, unity is lacking since it lacks a supreme and universal head. So the Archbishop of Canterbury is their head, but he doesn't have any real authority to impose anything. It's all private spirit. In other words, it's all that goes back to the same thing. I decide, and authority doesn't have any power to tell me what to think or to do. Something like the Society of St. Pius X. The very high church is nothing more than a part of the established church, which is considered to include the low church and the broad church and the subdivisions of other sects. The Methodists have bishops too. The Anglican Church, by word and deed, shows that it must be governed by the civil authority. The head of the church in England is the king. A layperson, generally not very edifying. Like Edward the Seventh, totally debauched person, fat. And anyway, so it's the authority is the king. Need I say more? But these things militate against a divinely established unity. Instance, the sects, however many there are all united in their opposition to the Pope. That's the one thing that unites Protestants, is they hate Catholicism. That they have. They have a unity in their hatred of Catholicism, and especially the Pope, a real Pope. They have that all in common. It's true. That doesn't give them unity, though. I distinguish the antecedent that this is a negative unity, let it pass. Positive, I deny. So it's a purely negative thing. It can hardly be said by how many diverse elements the hatred of the papacy comes together. This is nothing else than to present an absurd kind of unity, concerning which St. Jerome says, they fight among themselves, they agree in their attack upon the church, in the same way in which Herod and Pilate, who were at the same time enemies, became friends in the Passion of Christ. Leave it to St. Jerome. St. Jerome was famous for, let's say, telling it like it is. He didn't hold back, let's put it that way. St. Jerome. All right, so that's Protestants. So again, you might, there's a number of Protestants that come to us for conversion, and you might want to read over these things before you instruct them. They should understand why Protestantism is wrong, and but it's not unusual. I mean, they somehow perceive that the Catholic Church, it cannot be found in, or the Catholic faith, let's say, cannot be found in the Novus Ordo. They see it as really just more Protestantism. See, so, and that's exactly what it is. Article 2, whether the mark of unity is found in the schismatic churches, and this comes up occasionally. And there's some Catholics that go over to the Greek Orthodox because the Greek Orthodox believe in God. You see, so they're just longing for some sort of, you might say, supernatural religion. In that sense, they have very nice ceremonies and they have strict beliefs, etc. Unlike the Novus Ordo, which is a joke. So you want to draw them away from that because it's schismatic, obviously. So with St. Thomas, we call schismatics those who refuse to submit to the Roman pontiff and who refuse to be in communion with those who are subject to him. And that's the definition in canon law. Refuse to submit to the Roman pontiff and who refuse to be in communion with those who are subject to him. The schismatic churches are principally the Church of Constantinople and the Russian Church, which is also called the Ruthenian Church. Same thing. That's like west, it's on the border of, Czechoslovakia, part of Russia, but, or at least it was Russian Empire. This was written at the time of the Tsars. So. They are called Phocians because their founder was Photius. And there's a wonderful 3-volume work in German, if you want to read it, by Cardinal Hergenrother, on Photius, and it's in the library across the way. If you want to start reading that. 3 thick volumes on Photius. So, from these it seems that one ought to distinguish the Oriental sects such as the Nestorians and the Jacobites. Now, Nestorians come from Nestorius, the Patriarch of Constantinople. It's a heresy that Our Lady is not the Mother of God. The Jacobites, the same thing. I forget who they came from, but that is not Phocianism. Phocianism comes originally from the schism of Photius. But Photius eventually gave up his schism, and the East went back. That was in the 850s AD, more or less. And then, but in the 1000s, 1054, you have Michael Cerularius, which means Michael Blue, really. Cerulus means blue in Latin, but I don't know why he's called Michael Blue. But anyway, he was the Archbishop of Constantinople, and he was the one that really did the schism. And he said that the Latin rite masses are invalid because we use unleavened bread, among other things, yes. They don't believe in purgatory. So there's a lot of heresy involved. They don't believe in the Immaculate Conception, obviously. They believe in divorce and remarriage. Greek Orthodox. Now, there's a lot more Eastern Rite sect, or Eastern, not Rite, but Eastern. I think there's 16. He's mentioning the Russian and the Greek. Those are the big ones. Actually, the Russian is the biggest. But there's others, spread all out all over that area. It's you're not dealing with one church, one big church. You're dealing with various churches, or whatever you want to call them. Yes.
Do they have different doctrines or things that they disagree on, or is it more just nationality based?
I don't know. I don't know the answer to that question. It certainly is nationality based. You have the Coptics in Egypt, but again, there's no idea of a central authority which defines dogma. They say you can't have any more. They go by the councils up to, I think, in 600. I think there was one of the Constantinople councils. Those they take, but after that, the church cannot have a council because Rome is separated from us. They can't, so no general council is possible. So it's a sort of a dead church from the point of view of doctrine, or any kind of definition, any kind of dogmatic life, you might say. See, so I really don't know. I don't get involved with them too much at all. But there's many more than what he's mentioning here, but these are the two big ones: Constantinople and Moscow. See, Moscow declared itself the new Rome, the third Rome, because Constantinople declared itself the third Rome, but when it was taken over by Turks, then Moscow said, we are the new center of Christianity, the third Rome. Yes. And its patriarch was a former KGB agent. And the Russian seminarians that we had said all of the bishops and clergy were, especially bishops, they said, were KGB agents. So there was, they can't trust any of the sacraments. They didn't know, all they knew how to do was spy on people. So, they probably have lost validity in the sacraments to a great extent. But Photius was the instigator, the original instigator of the schism. So from these, it seems that one ought to distinguish the Oriental sects, such as the Nestorians, as we said, that the Church of Constantinople. This church broke off from the Church of Rome through the machinations of Photius, those are his dates, and Michael Cerularius, who died in 1059, which we just said. Photius, on Christmas Day of the year 857, was consecrated a bishop at the instigation of Michael the Emperor, who was young and fatuous, that means lightheaded and silly, and Barda, who ruined the integrity of Michael's morals in order to obtain power. Now, if you want to read a soap opera of one corruption after the other, read the history of the Byzantine Empire. That court was totally corrupt and full of intrigues, murders, poisonings, and various things. Just be, this is what all this comes from, a totally corrupt empire. That's why gradually it just petered out. Right, so Barda was the Eve to Michael, the Emperor, Adam. Against what was required by the canons, having been made a bishop only a few days from being a layman. So he was promoted rather quickly. Imagine doing that ceremony without observance of the proper time intervals. To the see of Constantinople, where Ignatius was a legitimate bishop and successor, who was not deposed, but did not validly abdicate, and did not validly abdicate. So, so he was sort of set aside by Gregory of Syracuse, a schismatic bishop whom Ignatius had deposed. So he was consecrated by a schismatic bishop. Photius, although Nicholas the Great, the Roman pontiff, was resisting this prevarication, managed to remain in the see of Ignatius by evil means. So Ignatius was told to go away. So he inserted himself into the see of Constantinople. He rebuked the Latins about certain disciplines such as fasting and celibacy. Yes, very saintly person. He is canonized as saint. He's Saint Photius in the Greek Orthodox Church. You see, churches named for Saint Photius. Yes. That's why I say, this Leo. You want unity. Unity. Are they going to change all their churches' names? Are they, all these schismatics and all? I mean, are they going to tell all the people that are invalidly remarried after that, by the way, you're not married? Of course not. I don't know if you saw how he defended the leftist Democrat senator, Durbin in Illinois, who was retiring and who voted consistently for legalized abortion, his whole life, his whole career, and LGBTQ agenda. And he was given and the Supich of the Archbishop of Chicago was about to give him an award, for his service in the Senate. So there were 10 Novus Ordo bishops who said, no, this is terrible, because he was in favor of abortion. And so when Leo was asked about it, he said, well, you have to look at the general, his whole career. And also, I don't think that people who are in favor of capital punishment are pro-life either. And I don't think that the treatment of the inhumane treatment of immigrants is pro-life. So putting the murder of babies this is what he's doing on the same level as being in favor of capital punishment. Do you know how many, maybe dozens of people are put to death for capital punishment in this country? All right, no matter what you want to say, capital punishment is a teaching of the church, but it's completely legitimate. But there are more than 60 million babies put to death in this country since 1973 because it was legalized. He's comparing those two things, and then inhumane treatment of he calls them immigrants, illegal aliens who are deported according to the law. You walk into any country, you have to show your passport, you have to show a visa. Everyone has laws about who gets into the country or not. Every country in the world has that. And they're deported according to law. That this is like being not pro-life. I mean, the blood of 60 million innocent babies is compared to those things. He's taking a lot of heat on it, though. He has dashed the hopes of all of the conservatives, but anyway, I mean, he is. And then the sacred ice cube. Did you see that? Yeah, the sacred sacred ice cube. There was a pagan ceremony of. He was sitting on a chair. There's no crucifix, nothing. And there's all of these leftists who are interested in climate change, And so they all took a glass of water from each of their countries and poured it into a bowl in front of him. Okay. Yes, because this ceremony. Then he goes over to this enormous piece of ice from Greenland, and he puts his hand on it very, very solemnly, and keeps it there. And he takes it off and goes back to his throne. Yes. There was one lady there sitting practically next to him with her legs crossed. The whole thing was disgusting. It was totally pagan. Yeah, the Great Ice Cube. What the Great Ice Cube has to do with climate change, I don't know, but he had to, somehow worship the ice cube. So that's our fault. I hope he lives forever too. So anyway, Photius, so he criticized the doctrine of the procession of the Holy Ghost ex patre filioque as a dogmatic error. He even held that when the emperors transferred from the city of Rome to Constantinople, at that time the primacy of the Roman see transferred also to Constantinople, and with the royal dignities, the privileges of the Roman see were also transferred. So when Constantine went to Constantinople and moved the capital of the empire, that's when Rome ceased to have any prominence. Photius was deposed in the 8th Ecumenical Council, 869. When Ignatius died, that's the true Archbishop of Constantinople, John VIII, the Roman pontiff, for the peace and usefulness of the Church of God, admitted Photius again as the Patriarch of Constantinople with certain conditions. But soon as fraudulent behavior began to increase, he was deposed again and ejected from his see, and he again fomented schism. He was exiled in the year 891, and it appears that he died in pertinacity. That means he did not recant. So that's Photius. At the end of the 9th century, the union of the Orientals with the Roman Church was restored under Antonius Caulea. So the end of the 800s. So it all got patched up. But in the middle of the 11th century, Michael Cerularius restored the schism. He too came from the lay state to the episcopacy and to the see of Constantinople without the canonical intervals. He conceived in his mind a hatred for the Latins. When his hatred erupted, he attacked the Latins for using unleavened bread in the Holy Eucharist, for eating suffocated meat and for having inserted filioque in the creed and other things. Yes. Right. He dared to have himself called ecumenical patriarch. Now, ecumenical has changed in meaning. Ecumenical simply means universal. Comes from a Greek word oikumene, which means household. So it's the entire household of the church, you might say, the whole deal in that sense. That's what ecumenical patriarch means. I'm in charge of the whole Catholic Church. That's the meaning of an ecumenical council. That is, everyone who has title to be invited is invited. All the ordinaries and whoever else the Pope wants to invite. But the ordinaries, that means bishops of dioceses, have the right to be called to an ecumenical council. See, so, but then ecumenical, he took on the idea of ecumenism, which is, I don't have to tell you what that is, mixing religions, all right, which is condemned by the church. So he too came from the lay state to the episcopacy and to the see of Constantinople without the canonical intervals. Okay, that's right. By stirring up many minds which were implicated in the Phocian cause, he led them into a schismatic spirit. In the year 1054, on the 16th of July, the legates of Leo IX placed the sentence of excommunication upon Cerularius on the altar of Santa Sophia in Constantinople. So there was a big fight because Leo IX, who was a very great pope, by the way, sent legates to Constantinople to solve the problem, and they didn't, and they put excommunication of Cerularius, and that is the beginning of the schism, which has never been solved. Well, take that back. Twice it was solved, but then the people rejected it. We'll see that. Cerularius in the year 1059 was sent into exile by Isaac Comnenus the emperor, and he died shortly thereafter. He was praised by subsequent schismatics. I don't know if he's a saint too, I don't know. The disaster of dissidents infected the entire East. Photius assigned 10 crimes to the Latins, Cerularius 22, and Nicetas Sedus at the beginning of the 12th century 32 things that are wrong with the Latins. The accusations increased a great deal in the 13th century. In the 14th century, 600 heresies of the Roman Church were brought up. Most of all, the authority of the Roman pontiff was repudiated. This is the history of this church. And if you read the history of Byzantium, you'll see that. If you read the history of the schism, it's appalling. All right? But it all goes back to the authority of the Roman pontiff. Filioque goes back to that. If he is the teacher of the Catholic Church, the infallible teacher of the Catholic Church, he has the right to insert filioque in the creed, just as the First Council of Constantinople amplified the Creed of Nicaea. And the Athanasian Creed, my goodness, how long that is. Talk about amplified. See? And filioque has a very strong history in the Fathers. You'll do that in another course. So it really goes back to the Pope. You see, part of it was political. In the years like 500s, 600s, 700s, technically Italy belonged to the Byzantine Empire, but they were not protecting Italy from the Lombards and other immigrants that were coming in. All right. Gregory the Great didn't have a high opinion of the Lombardic immigrants. He said he thought it was the end of the world because of what the Lombards were doing. All right, so I think he was sort of on the wrong side of Leo, But anyway, so finally, to make a very long story short, the Franks intervened to protect the Pope from the Lombards, and to make a long story even shorter, the Pope crowned Charlemagne emperor in the West, and that just made the East go berserk. That was in 800 A.D., Christmas Day of 800 A.D. So you see, in the 800s, they're thinking, well, we're supposed to be the Roman Empire. See, the Roman Empire. They always considered themselves a Roman Empire right up to the time that they fell in 1453. So they have betrayed us. So there was a political thing too in this. Greeks tend to be very, very nationalistic. I don't know if you've ever had any contact with Greeks, but they're very, very nationalistic, and they're people and all that. So there's a lot of that in this. So many times the Supreme Pontiffs did everything they could in order to reconcile the schismatics, mostly in the Second Council of Lyons, where the legates that were sent from Constantinople agreed to everything that was proposed to them by the Second Council of Lyons, and sang 3 times Filioque in the Creed. Filioque, Filioque, Filioque. Recently, Leo, in reciting the Creed with a bunch of schismatics, coughed or swallowed during Filioque. Yeah. So, all right. So, and then the Council of Florence, they all caved in again. All right, they all said, okay, we'll come back and we'll accept the primacy of the Roman Pontiff, 1439. You can read about it. By the way, a very good work, and it's in the library, is Parsons for all of those disputed things in church history, and he's very good on this subject. Parsons, I forget the title of it, but it's in the library. So they all said, fine, we're with you, Rome, and no problem. And that, again, was a bit motivated by politics, because the Turks were practically at the gates of Constantinople. And they wanted the West to intervene, something like NATO, to intervene to push back the Turks. But same thing happened in 1274. They went back to Constantinople, and the people said, we want nothing to do with the Romans. Then the same thing happened. They went back to Constantinople, and the people said, we would rather be subject to the Sultan than to the Pope. So they couldn't, they really, no authority. In the West, the bishop would say, well, you're excommunicated. But they were afraid of their people. So Mark of Ephesus, by his instigations, ruined the noble work of Eugene IV, that was the Pope, and Nicholas V. Those were the popes involved in that reconciliation in the 15th century. In the year 1453, Constantinople was captured by Mohammed II, and the Greek church fell under the yoke of the infidels. They even mentioned the Sultan in the canon. Let's talk about una cum. All right, the schismatic church, which is called by its own adherents the Eastern Orthodox, now principally remains within the limits of the Turkish Empire. And at that time, that's Turkey and the Middle East since 1919. In other words, at that time, when this was written, Turkish Empire was present-day Turkey and that whole crescent, you might say, going around to Egypt. And that was about it at that time, because they lost a lot of northern Africa. But it was that whole swath, that was the Turkish Empire. Arabia too, Saudi Arabia. And they all hated each other. But they hated Turkey more than they hated each other, and that's what kept them together. They all hated Constantinople, or Istanbul. Okay? And now that's called the Middle East. Since 1919, and that's when the European powers cut it all up. And All of the trouble in that area is because of the Europeans cutting up that thing. All of it. So, the Russian church. We shall pass over the early attempts at evangelization. The Russian people heard the gospel from priests who belonged to the Patriarchate of Constantinople in those times when the Eastern Church was joined to the Roman Church. See, so they were evangelized by Catholic priests. That's a long time. That's 200 years, practically. 200 years ago is 1825. So that's considerable. For this reason, Michael I, Leontius, John, and Theopemptus were the first metropolitans of Kiev. See, the original Russia was Kiev. That's why the Russians feel, have this attraction to Ukraine, because Kiev was their original capital, and that's where the original patriarch was, the Russian Church, which was Catholic. For this reason, okay, were linked peacefully with Rome. The same may be said of Hilarion, George I, John II, and Ephraim, the successors of Theopemptus, up to 1096. Nicaphore I, the Metropolitan of Kiev, is considered to be the principal author of the Russian schism. In the end, the germs of the Greek schism were spread throughout Russia. But the schism was not approved by all. In 1439, Isidore signed the decrees of the Council of Florence as Metropolitan of Kiev and of all Russia. So he joined up in 1439. And that's why Pius XII, this is something you should know. There was a famous Saint Sergei, who was a very, you might say, led a very ascetic life in the Russian Orthodox Church. And he was very prayerful, etc., etc. He died in this period when the Russians, this short period when the Russians were reconciled to Rome. And that's why Pius XII permitted that his name be placed in the Eastern Rite martyrology, because he died a Catholic. And he was, as I said, very ascetic and had all the other qualities of being a saint. But that's brought up, Pius XII is ecumenical, blah, blah, blah. That's the reason I looked it up. See, when you got to go back to your books, and because people throw up all of this stuff. So that's when he died, is Saint Sergei. I saw, actually, when I was in Russia, I went out to see his monastery, which is magnificent. It was built up after him. But it was, the big onion domes, and just very, very, and that famous icon of the Trinity is there. It's on a wall. It's a famous Russian icon of the Trinity. It's painted on a wall, and I saw that, and it's very impressive. Unfortunately, it's schismatic. They certainly, for all their faults, they have a certain a sense of the sacred, in their liturgy, and nothing like that was sort of, and that's why they are attractive to certain Catholics. So, in the year 1458, the Metropolitancy of Kiev was divided into two parts, with the effect that the Metropolitan of Moscow would rule northern Russia and that of Kiev would rule southern Russia. The Metropolitans of Moscow were inclined to union with the Church of Rome. Those of Kiev, from Isidore to Jonas II, were not opposed to the decrees of Florence. In fact, Isidore himself and Gregory II and Joseph II, the Sultan, labored in order that the union be propagated and confirmed. From Jonas II to the deposition of Onesiphorus, Schism prevailed in the See of Kiev. And finally, the greater part of the Russians or Ruthenians, same thing, who gave obedience to the Metropolitan of Kiev sought union. And under Clement VIII, who reigned late 1500s, early 1600s, he's the one that burned Giordano Bruno, capital punishment. The Roman pontiff, all the bishops who pertained to the Metropolitan See of Kiev, except two, returned to unity. But the Uniates to this day have often undergone persecution. So there is a Uniate Ruthenian church. There's a Uniate Ukrainians. Those would be Uniate Ukrainians. But the Orthodox can't stand them, and the Orthodox are sort of in charge in Ukraine and in Russia too. So, that's the Russians. So, but you see that there was. I'm always amazed that not a single non-Catholic sect has come to the Novus Ordo since the council. Not one single one. Whereas the Catholic Church in the past was always holding out its arms to these people to come back. And in India, Pius XI reconciled the, Syro-Malabar rite, who had been evangelized by the Nestorians, the heretics. So they were heretics as well as, and he reconciled a certain number of them. There are still two, the Syro-Malabars, and which is in the southwest part of India, and he actually accepted their rites that they had concocted in heresy with certain changes. In other words, that's how far the church bends over backwards to accommodate people coming back from schism or heresy. Because whatever we can do to make it happen, we'll try to make it happen. The church always had this. Pius IX invited the Greek schismatics to the First Vatican Council. They didn't come, but he invited them. There has always been this outreach, as they say, to these people. The Second Council of Lyons, Council of Florence. It's as if the Catholic Church had shut the door on everybody and couldn't care less. That is absolutely false. But it did not in any way compromise its own doctrines. So that was under Pius XI, 1930s, I think. You can read that about. There's a lot to look around. This is all church history in here. You can start reading these books. You have to know your stuff. That's why I say the priest today has to know a lot more than the priest of yesteryear. You have to defend yourself against all of this garbage. All right, in the year 1589, I have 1 minute before I can go and frolic for 10 minutes. When Jeremiah II, the Patriarch of Constantinople, raised the See of Moscow to a patriarchate, Job, the Metropolitan of Moscow, was created the first patriarch of that see by Theodore I, the emperor. So 1589, late 1500s, Russia is starting to emerge as an organized big country. Ivan the Terrible, and he was terrible, was active during the reign of Pius V. So that's 1560s, 1570s. You see, so then they had troubled times, and then the Romanovs were put on the throne around 1600 or so, the early 1600s, and that they lasted until until they were shot in 1917. And as a matter of fact, they celebrated, it must have been 1612, because in 1912, they went around the whole Russia the royal family, celebrating the 300 years of the Romanov dynasty. That was, so it would have been 1612. Only so much you can take. I'm categorizing the pamphlets in there, the many pamphlets. You'll see there's boxes of.
Oh, that's right.
Yeah, and then there's the pamphlets that are already in the library.